Hello, everyone. I want to do a review of the final exam just so uh, be clear about what sort of answers I was looking for. Here in the instructions, something was quite important. First of all, that your answers to the questions really didn't need to be long in any case. 1 or 2 paragraphs was fine. The important thing was what was said next. Don't use quotations from the readings or from any other source. Your answers must be in your own words. That was quite important because an exam in a subject like philosophy is really about being able to articulate the ideas in your own language or for yourself. So it's quite important not to answer a question by quoting or borrowing from anyone else, obviously, but putting it in your own words. Let's take a look at the questions. Question one, put in your own words Epicurus's reasons for why death cannot be considered a bad thing. I think most people had a very firm grasp of this. Um, and the important thing here, I think, is to reflect what he actually said. And what he actually said was something along the lines of when we are, death has not come, and when death has come, we are not. So it's nothing to us. And that's really because we can't experience it. It's as Epicurus says, for something to be good or bad for us, we have to have some awareness of it. And since death is the taking away of all awareness, we can't have any awareness of it, and therefore it can't be a bad thing for us. That was the general idea. Uh, as always, some people said, well, Epicurus says death happens to everybody, and death is inevitable, and therefore we shouldn't care about it. Again, that's maybe a natural misreading of it because it seems like he should be saying that, but he never actually says that. So if you wrote that the reason that Epicurus thinks that death is a bad thing for us is because it's natural or it's inevitable or it happens to everybody, something along those lines, that was incorrect. Number two, explain how Nagel's hypothetical about the man with the brain injury helps to support the idea that death is a bad for the one who dies. The key here is that the man with the brain injury, something terrible, something bad has happened to him, but he's not suffering as a result of it, and he's not even aware of the loss that he's incurred. Yet, Nagel says, something bad has indeed happened to him, although he's not suffering any unpleasant states, and although he's not even aware of the loss, he still experienced the loss, and something bad is still happening. And that's the key to Nagel's essay. And the key is to point out in your answer that, well, that's analogous. His position is analogous to the dead, to someone who's died. Obviously, someone who's died is not aware that they've died, and someone who's died is not suffering because they've died. Yet something bad has happened, and that's the key to that question. Is pointing out the analogy between the man with the brain injury and the dead in those respects. Number three, explain what the asymmetry problem is. This was not about the solution to the asymmetry problem. This was not about uh, Bruckner and Fisher's ideas. This is just the asymmetry problem itself. That's why there is separate video on it, separate discussion of it. The asymmetry problem is the idea that there is something called prenatal non-existence, the fact that we didn't exist before we were born. And there is a posthumous non-existence, that we won't exist after we die. And that these are simply both periods of non-existence, of nothingness, for us. And yet so they're the same thing, basically, just non-existence or nothingness. Yet we're totally indifferent about our prenatal, before birth non-existence, and we think that our posthumous non-existence is a bad thing. And that's the problem, is that we treat them asymmetrically. When, according to the classical statement of the problem, we should treat them symmetrically. Question four, what is Bruckner and Fisher's proposed solution to the asymmetry problem? Here you had to grasp what it would mean to solve the asymmetry problem in general, which is basically to prove that there is a relevant difference between prenatal and posthumous non-existence that would justify their asymmetrical treatment. And Hooker and Fisher do have such a solution. I mean, their solution, which is that we care more about future pleasures and goods than we do about past. So we care more about the fact that we will be deprived of them by death, posthumous non-existence, than that we were deprived by our prenatal non-existence. So that's the answer to that question. Question 5, what does Jonas mean when he says that an organism's being is its own doing? That is, that this could be answered in various ways, certainly by reference to metabolism, the idea that we have to continue to act in order to survive, but just generally philosophically speaking, that our being is not an achieved state, that an organism being is in constant activity and must be in order to remain the thing that it is, unlike other non-living things. Question 6, explain Diaspora's general idea of the boundary situation and explain why death is such a situation. So boundary situations are limits in which we run up against the limits of our autonomy, our ability to change things, and our ability to be, to control our lives or even do anything. Boundary situations are things like guilt, chance, suffering, conflict, things that we cannot change, that we simply have to accept and understand, perhaps, but we cannot change. And death is such a situation. Something that cannot be escaped and something that we cannot change, we can only seek to understand. Question 7, describe Socrates' basic assumption about what death is in the Phaedo. He actually defines death at a certain point, then explain what, given his definition, he then has to prove in order to make his case about immortality. So this is a two-step question, and you had to answer both steps to get full credit. This is something that was really emphasized in the videos. First of all, his basic assumption about death is that it is the separation of soul and body. He does define that at a certain point in the Phaedo. So that's the first part of the question. This is his assumption about what death is that it's the separation of soul and body. Then what does he have to prove at that point to make his case about immortality? He has to prove that once that separation takes place, that the soul can actually exist without the body. That's the whole point of the dialogue, actually. So, yeah, this question has a definite answer. And that is, number one, his definition of death is the separation of soul and body. Number two, he has to prove that the soul can exist without body. According to Landsberg, what is death? I mean, that's a rather open-ended question. Just looking for some reflection of an understanding, some grasp of his general approach. For him, you could say that death is menace and threat. Death is the enemy. Seeks to wipe us out as individuals. You could take that tack. You could also take the tack that death is isolation from community, and that the threat and menace of death is really not so much non-existence, but the fact that it isolates us from our community, it isolates us from love. You could take the approach that death is alien. It comes from an alien sphere. It is not natural to the person, although it may be natural to the organism. It is not natural to the person. Anything that reflected something of Landsberg's approach. Question 9, explain Hartshorne's reason for thinking that the afterlife cannot consist of endless new experience. This is a difficult question. Most of the answers were circular, and that's okay. But really, for full credit, Hartshorne's reason for thinking that the afterlife cannot consist of endless new experience is that we are not God. That is, if we had an open-ended afterlife that consisted of new experiences forever, we would have to be infinite beings. And it is part of our essential nature as persons that we are not infinite, we are finite. So he thinks that the idea of new experiences, endless new experiences, infinite new experiences in the afterlife is a logical impossibility. Question 10, explain why Jonas's idea of the Book of Life requires a, quote, suffering God. I didn't know how the word suffering is being used there, which is certainly pointed out in the videos, in the text itself. Suffering in the sense of being affected by, not necessarily of having a bad feeling or experiencing pain. A suffering God will be a God that is affected by our actions. And that's a key part of Jonas's idea of the book of life. That is, that through our actions, we are actually shaping God. God is being affected by us. God suffers in the sense that God is changed or affected by our actions. Question 11. Explain why the distinction between a desire and a wish is important for Gustafson's definition of grief. If it's important because the presence of the desire that somebody still be alive who is dead, rather than the wish, is really an important distinction about whether or not somebody is actually grieving. A desire is when you have a full, active want that something be so or not be so. A wish is when you have an idle hope or an idle preference, let's say, that something be so. And so a desire is action motivating, whereas a wish is not. And so the Gustafson idea is that if we desire something to be so, which we know cannot be so, we are in an irrational state because we are constantly motivated to do something that is impossible, or we're motivated to make something happen that couldn't possibly happen. So we're in an irrational state, and that's important for his definition of what the state of grieving is. Whereas if we merely wish that something were true, we don't necessarily feel any motivation to make it so. And if we wish that something were so that we know couldn't be so, we are not in such an irrational state, and therefore we're not grieving. Question 12. Does Lewis believe that his dead wife still exists in some form? He's just looking for something. I mean, there's no clear answer to that. I think the answer is yes. The answer may be no. And I mean, in the sense that, well, what do you mean by exist, right? So there was no right or wrong answer here. Just looking for some reflection of some knowledge of the text in this respect. I would say that he does, but that form is so different from his form. That's kind of the point. That is, that she does still exist in a form that he cannot relate to or access or contact in the form that he's in, his earthly form. Finally, question 13. Why does Schultz think that our modern view of death is closer to the Homeric Greeks and the Hebrews than to Plato or Christianity? I mean, the key there is his characterization of Plato and Christianity as having a metaphysical view of death, this notion that death is a transition. Death is to be spoken of in the context of immortality. Thinking of the human being at death not ceasing to exist, but transitioning to a new form, some new form of existence. That is something that the modern, as I think Jonas would agree, modern temper or the modern outlook can't really fully accept, and that the Homeric Greeks and the Hebrews, who had a much murkier view of the afterlife, that the that the human being existed only as a pale reflection of its real self, a kind of a shade, is closer to our view, and that our view is that the person, the dead person, really only exists. Their only existence is insofar as they're remembered by the living, and that's very fragile and temporary or transitory, as he says, so that our view of death is closer to those pre-Christian, pre-Platonic ways of thinking. So that's what I was looking for in the final exam. Grades are, I'm going to put in grades right now. I mean, I have to do that. So there's, this is just for explanatory purposes. But if you do have any questions, please let me know.